now that we know what aperture is physically and have some idea of setting it, what units we use, right? We have these stops. Some lenses go to a very, very large opening indeed, 1.4. Some lenses, the largest opening they could get might be 5.6. Some lenses, if they're a kit zoom, will have a range depending on where they are in their focal length of what their maximum aperture will be. So why would we choose one versus the other? So let's take a look at that. So here we have Pinocchio. You lying sack of... So Pinocchio is here on a bookcase, and we can see right away that the books in the foreground and the books way off in the background are not sharp, right? They are out of focus. It's not motion blur, right? The books aren't like, at least not while I'm watching them, but they are out of focus. So Pinocchio, right? I've got that little arrow pointing to his schnoz. Pinocchio is in focus because he is what I have focused the camera on. Right? Whatever you focused on is always in focus, period. So he's in focus, that's great, but the stuff in front of him is out of focus, the stuff behind him is out of focus. If we look, here is Pinocchio again at, let's see, I have his f2, Pinocchio at f2, and basically Pinocchio is in focus as I myself go in and out of focus. Pinocchio is in focus, and that's about it. If I go from f2, right, again, big old honking opening. If I go from f2 to f4, so I've taken that and I've made it a little smaller. How much? All right, remember, if we look at the sort of scale of apertures, we go from f2, 2.8, 4. Right, so I've taken my aperture and I've closed down one stop to 2.8, 2 stops to f4. So aperture is 2 stops smaller. Obviously, if we look at this, my exposure is the same, so I must have adjusted my shutter speed or ISO to keep the same exposure because I'm smart like that. So we can see what happens when we change from a bigger aperture to a slightly smaller aperture. Everything is super, super out of focus there. Here, right, if I look at those foreground books, they're a little sharper in f4. I can start to read the edge of the book right behind Pinocchio. That's f4. If I go to f11, now I have a significantly larger amount of bookshelf in focus, and even the stuff that's out of focus, right? I can sort of see over here, I can see it a lot more clearly. All right, these are definitely books. Maybe this is a clock radio, I'm not sure. But all of these books here are super crispy and easy to see. Just for reference, right, here we are back at f2. Here we are at f11. And then if I close it all the way down, I'm here at f22, and almost the entire bookcase is sharp. So that's what aperture does, right? That is the aesthetic, visual, sort of like camera thinking photographer portion of aperture. Yes, it can adjust your exposure, right? But why you choose a particular aperture is dependent on depth of field. So if I want lots of stuff in focus, right? Remember, whatever I focused on is sharp, but if I want lots of stuff in front of it and lots of stuff behind it also in focus, then I want to use a little tiny opening, right? Little tiny opening, larger number. You can think of it as a larger number means a larger amount of stuff in focus, right? A smaller number means a smaller amount of stuff in focus. You can remember that as long as you also remember that a large number is a tiny hole and a small number is a bigger hole. Those are two things. They seem like they're going opposite directions. Sit down, memorize them. It's fine. So that's what Aperture is good for. We adjust our exposure speed to whatever we want using our shutter speed and our ISO. We choose our aperture first for this assignment based on how much depth of field we want. There's a couple of other ways we can control depth of field besides simply aperture, right? Aperture is always there, aperture is always in play, but there are two other things that come into the depth of field game. One of them is subject, whatever it is we're taking a picture of, camera distance. So if I have my camera set up here and I'm taking a picture, I'm going to have some amount of distance in front of the person. Let's say I'm taking a picture of a person. Some amount of distance in front of the person that's in focus, some amount of distance behind the person that's in focus. Let's say I'm taking a portrait of you, right? Ooh, reaching through the screens. If I'm taking a picture of you and I'm, say, 3 feet away from you, all right, cool, take a picture. I'm at f8, for lack of a better f-stop to think of. Maybe you have 12 inches in front of you and 24 inches behind you that are also in focus. So if you're standing right in front of a bookcase, the bookcase is in focus. If you're holding out a flower, the flower is in focus. If you're holding out a sword next to the flower, because I'm making some weird portrait about like peace and war, man, that's probably not, right? That one's like sticking way out there, the end of the sword out of focus. If now I'm like, oh, this location is so boring, and we go out into a field and now you're standing like 30 feet away from me, I'm still at f8, right? I focus at you, you're 30 feet away. Now, right, you are going to have more physical distance in front of you and more physical distance behind you in focus because you are farther from the camera. So now the tip of your sword is in focus and the flower is in focus and maybe the apple tree 10 feet back also in focus. Let's look at an example of that. So here we have two pictures that were taken at f5.6. The one over here, these are some dominoes. These are taken from, I don't know, like 1.5 feet away. So my camera's up really, really close to these dominoes. And if we zoom in on them, we can see that that first domino is sharp and the second domino, a little bit soft. Third domino, definitely soft. Fourth domino, super, super blurry. So that is a noticeable change. The other domino, whoo, forget about it. That is a noticeable fall off in sharpness within the course of, I don't know, maybe the dominoes are like 3/4 of an inch apart. Right, so if I am focused on that, 3/4 of an inch back, starting to lose focus, 1.5 inches back, definitely out of focus, 2¼ inches, like super soft. Right, so that is a little itty bitty thing measured in inches of how much depth of field I have. Now, if I go over here, this is a picture also shot at 5.6, but the point that I focused on, instead of being, 18 inches away, is probably a mile away, honestly, if not farther. So here I have this road, and let's say that I have focused on that point a mile away. If I had 3/4 of an inch in focus in front of it, and 3/4 of an inch in focus behind it, if by the time I got 2¼ inches away, it was super, super blurry, right? All of this stuff that is like miles and miles in the distance would be completely blurred out and you would have no idea what it was, right? Same thing with the foreground. All this foreground would be completely blurry and unrecognizable, and you would just have this teeny tiny little itty bitty bit of sharpness over there in the middle somewhere. But you don't, right? You are so far away that almost the whole thing looks like it's in focus. So the farther I get from whatever my subject is, the more depth of field I have at any given aperture, right? At a certain distance, right? If I'm far enough away, my aperture doesn't really matter, right? If I'm like 5 miles away, I could shoot at f1.4. You're not going to notice any real difference. Likewise, if I'm super, super close up to something, it is going to be hard for me to have lots of depth of field, even if I close my aperture all the way down. This is why, if you do a quick Google search right now, pause the video, do a quick Google search for pictures of flowers and pictures of cars, right? Pictures of flowers, most of the time, right, it's a close-up picture of a flower, most of the time the background's out of focus. Pictures of cars, right, there are exceptions to all these things, most of the time the background is in focus. So if you just go find a picture of a car sitting on the street, car at a car show, background is more likely to be in focus. Why? Because you're taking a picture of a car from like 20 feet away, because otherwise, you can't get the whole car in the picture. Likewise, flowers, you're generally taking a picture from relatively close up, right? Because you're trying to just focus on that one flower. So subject camera distance, important secondary way that we can control depth of field. First way, aperture. Second way, subject camera distance. And the third way is pretty similar to the way that we're thinking about subject camera distance, and that's focal length. So if I am, and there's an important caveat about this, which is basically like, hey, it's not really true, so don't get in a fight in a bar about it. I mean, you shouldn't be going to a bar anyway. Come on, you're underage. Stop it. Besides, pandemic. Come on, jeez. As you stay in one place and zoom in on something, if I increase my focal length, my relative depth of field also drops. Right? So if I am taking a super close-up picture of just my face, right? If I look at it very closely, which you should never do, maybe my eye is in focus, the tip of my nose is in focus, my ears are out of focus. If I take a picture from the same location, same subject camera distance, but I go super wide angle and I can see the whole room, right? I zoom in there, I'm like, okay, well, now all of my face is in focus and the thing behind me in focus and maybe the view out the window is in focus. So focal length is the third way that we can control depth of field, right? So focal length, subject camera distance, and aperture. 3 ways to control it. What does it do, right? Like visually, what's sort of useful about a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field? And are there cases where it doesn't actually have any impact? The answer to the third one is yes. The answer to the first one, here is a picture. These are all from a book called American Pitbull. What's the name? Mark Joseph. American Pitbull, good book, right? Some great, beautiful photographs in it, interesting sort of documentary story. Yeah, worth checking out. So here's a picture of this dude and his dog. They're at a dog show. And the background behind them is super busy, right? So, sorry. There's whatever this big hall is that they're in back there, a bunch of fluorescent lights, some other maybe people over there, bunch of garbage. So by using really shallow depth of field, all of that stuff off in the distance behind him drops out, and all we're paying attention to is this sort of tender moment between the man and his dog, right? Or maybe he's taking a bite out of the dog. I don't know. Feels like a tender moment to me. So shallow depth of field allows you to focus on your subject, right? The background, if it's busy, if it's ugly, if it's distracting, drops out. So that's super, super helpful. If you're taking a portrait, right? If you're in a space where you don't want the space to really register, you want all the attention on the person, shallow depth of field would be very helpful. Sometimes it doesn't matter, right? This guy, the background, the only background we can see is pretty close behind him anyway, right? So, whoops, there we go, friend. So if we shot it with, f22, right, which is a big number, small opening, lots of depth of field, okay, he's in focus, the flag's in focus, because they're like 12 inches apart from each other. If I shoot it at f5.6, right, bigger opening, smaller number, shallower depth of field, they're still probably both in focus, right? Because I'm not super up close to him, and there's not a lot of foreground versus background. Everything in the picture is kind of the same distance away from the camera. So in this picture, depth of field, right, not really relevant. And then in this photograph, right, depth of field is relevant, but it's important that there's a lot of it, right? If I look at, pardon me, the dog picture, if it's important in, I can't zoom, oh no. If the dog picture, it's important to have very shallow depth of field. In the house picture, it's really important to have deep depth of field because it's a picture that is talking about this guy in this place, right? So we want to have both the guy and the place be sharp. We want both of those things as sort of co-equal actors in the scene. So 3 pictures, right? One with very shallow depth of field being important, making the picture better. One where choosing shallow depth of field or deep depth of field doesn't really matter because you can't tell what it is because everything is the same distance from the camera, right? If I take a picture of like a flat, if I take a picture of a pizza, right? I'm right over the pizza, looking straight down, flat pizza. I could shoot it at f5.6. I could shoot it at f22. The image would basically look the same. If I had a pizza with like a bunch of stuff sticking way out of it, okay, then I have a foreground and a background. Here, there is no foreground or background. There's just middle ground. It's all the same. And then lastly, this one, it's really important to have this very deep depth of field because it allows us to have all of the elements feel like they're in the same space and they are more sort of on equal terms. So that is what depth of field is good for, why we would choose one over the other. There are, if you go look at this handout, which you should, there's a couple more pages talking about how really focal length per se doesn't affect depth of field, which is true. And again, if you get in a fight in your backyard, socially distanced, look at those pages before you start, trading blows. But the way that we typically use it, right? The way that we typically use focal length to zoom in or zoom out while staying in one place, zooming in is going to give us shallower depth of field, and pulling the camera back to a wide angle shot is going to give us more depth of field. So if you're interested, if you're like, persnickety, read the other 2 pages. Otherwise, you are now good. You should have a good sense of how depth of field is affected by aperture, how depth of field can be affected by other things, subject camera distance, focal length, and why choosing a particular depth of field, why we make that choice as photographers.